Hi there guys and welcome to the Tantrum Show. Today I am speaking to Mike Birt from K2 Distribution, and today we are going to be talking about light wind kites. Now this is an awesome episode where we delve right into the science behind light wind kites, why they perform better, why they're different, and I think I certainly learned a lot, and I think you're going to learn an awful lot too. So again, it's a longer episode. Grab a coffee, sit back and enjoy. So first off, Mike, what would you say is the major difference, obviously excluding the obvious, between a light wind kite and what we would class as, a normal kite?
I'd say that the light wind kite, because of its size, it needs to be speeded up. Because if you take a 9 or a 10 meter kite and just upscale it, its physical size makes it very slow if you don't do any alterations from it. But big kites can go one of two ways. They can either become more maneuverable by increasing the size of the wingtips, or they can become more efficient by essentially decreasing the size of the wingtips and increasing the aspect ratio of them. So they can go one of a number of different ways once you sort of break above the traditional shape of an average 10 meter kite. It just depends on what type of performance you're looking for from your big kite, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So obviously, as you're getting to that size of kite, to the bigger scale of kite, weight, I would assume, becomes an issue. How much of an issue is weight when it comes to performance?
To be honest, weight is a massive issue to all kites. It's a bit like a car. The lighter your car is, the more tactile and the more capable it is in terms of turning and changing direction. Kite's the same. In light winds, you have the added pressure of the fact that there's not as much wind pinning them on the back of the window. So if they're heavy, everybody will identify with kites falling out of the sky. They call it Hindenburging, where the front's too heavy and they tip forward and they can't recover from their fall and they just crash to the ground. And that is primarily about weight. The weight literally overpowers the wind that's pushing them up and they fall to the ground. Yeah. And so aside from the falling out of the sky thing, the weight translates as mass, in that when the kite is asked to accelerate, if the kite is heavy and the power source is light, they don't tend to produce as much instant power as they do when they're a lot lighter. So they tend to be a bit sluggish, to be honest, and reducing the weight massively helps with the responsiveness of their power delivery and turning.
Right. So
and the other thing about weight, in really light winds, if you can get a kite stable above your head, you can dive it to the floor to produce power, but then when it gets low, a lot of kites can't overcome their weight in order to climb back up to the top of the window to initiate another power downstroke. So you'll see heavy race kites of 5 struts, for example. They'll go above your head, and you'll tweak them and pull them and get them above your head. Then you get one power strike down, but you can't pull it back up again. So if you're not up and going on the first power strike down, you're stuffed, because the thing's just going to fall in the water and you'll never get it out again. And then I guess the last thing as well is when the kite's in the water, like kites, water restart much more easily than heavy kites. So weight is a big thing.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, actually. Just on those last 2 points, this is something we saw all the time in light winds. We'd say, okay, well, let's just stick up a bigger kite. And it's not necessarily the answer, especially at the early stages. We find we'll just stick up a 14 meter, and that person would they'd get the first steer down and the kite just stalls at that point. And literally, it's Newton, I suppose. It can't overcome gravity to get back to the top of the window.
Yeah.
The other one is, as soon as you get a wet kite and get a bit of sand on it, often they just won't relaunch if the wind's you just cannot get the damn thing off the ground until you've beaten all the sand off it. So that makes a lot of sense, actually. Okay, cool. So One thing that's kind of struck me as well, which has confused me a little bit, is the fact that okay, you've got a light wind kite, which I assumed would be a huge kite, but now more and more manufacturers are building a light wind kite, maybe in a 6 meter, an 8 meter. Can you talk a little bit about that and why why you would want to go down that road?
Yeah, I mean, the pressure for that really started with foiling. Foiling started with the race community, really, in France, and now it's become much more of a free ride activity than a race activity. And you need a kite that's capable of operating in very light winds. So, I mean, we're blowing up kites and taking to the water now in 6 knots of wind with small kites. 9 meter was my biggest kite last year. And these kites have to be capable of water restarting very, very easily in 6 knots at 9 meters. They have to be capable of being quick, and they have to be able to sit above your head all day long, and underfly and drift. And that is really where the push for really trimming the weight down of kites has come from. And we've seen different designs permeate out throughout the industry, but it is a real engineering art to get good handling, lightweight, and build quality at the same time, because nobody wants to be, building them so light that they're made from tissue paper. So it's been a really interesting progression.
So is there, if I'm a twin tip rider, thinking about, okay, well, I'm looking at a kite like this, is there any need for me to go and look at a 9 meter light wind kite? Would there ever be a need for that, or is it just for foil boarders?
Yeah, 9 meter light wind kite. It doesn't really exist for a twin tip rider. Twin tips require 4 times the amount of energy power than a foil does. So the only real reason you need power on the foil is to get you up and on the foil, and that comes from the power spike you generate by throwing the kite around. And that's why we use such small kites, because the power spike is easy because the kites are fast. And then once we're up and running, we don't need anything more than 9 or 10 meters, really. Twin tip riders do. They need, in 8 knots of wind, you're looking at 15, 17 meters of constant pull in order to maintain a planing edge and keep you going upwind. So, yeah, you do need still big kites for twin tip riding, for sure.
Right, so that makes sense. So as a twin tip rider, I'm still going to be looking at the big kites, and it's only when you come into foil riding and things like this, or racing indeed, that you're looking at the smaller end, and that's what the smaller end of the light wind range exists for.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
Now, there's 3 objections that I always hear about light wind kites in general. First is relaunch. Is that generally seen as an issue these days?
Yeah, relaunching kites, it's very kite specific, and there is a knack to it. But we're getting kites out now in 6 knots of wind. Schools are teaching on the 17 meter lithium progressions now in 6 knots and upwards. So they're getting kites relaunched constantly in 6 knots. And it's a useful skill to learn, because you're going to use it if you get into foiling, for sure. And it's not difficult to do. Again, weight, having a light kite really helps. Having a bit of wingtip as well, and a fairly low aspect ratio really helps you get them on their side and back out of the water again. So the good relaunching kites tend to be concentrated towards the maneuver-oriented light wind kites, as opposed to the race kites, which, to be fair, those race kites, unless you've got a 5th line on them, forget it. When you're in the water, they're in the water. You've got an issue.
Yeah, a bit like the old days of the sea kites, the original sea kites, where you were swimming around the damn thing.
Yeah, exactly. Getting them on their back requires front crawl through the lines. No, it's just a bit of a nightmare. But modern medium aspect, maneuver-oriented light wind kites. You just sit there in the water, you play with the lines a bit, they're on the side, they're back up in the air again. They're pretty remarkable compared to what we were used to.
Right, okay, yeah. And I suppose as well, the other advantage that you've got is with, if you're out on a 17 meter kite, generally the sea state or the water state is going to be fairly calm. So you're not dealing with monster waves, huge amounts of white water piling onto the kite and things like that.
Yeah, no, it's fairly steady. I mean, surf's a bit of an issue still, but nobody really can expect to relaunch a kite if the waves keep dropping on top of its head.
Yeah, surf's an issue with all relaunching kites, isn't it? So I think that's never going to change until we can turn the surf off and The other one that I hear a lot of the time is you know, speed. You know, 17-meter kite is going to be so slow. It's just going to be like driving a bus. You know, I'd rather be doing something different when the wind's that light. You know, if it's that slow. Again, what would you say about that?
Speed. It's more of a power thing. Bigger the kite, more power you have. What you do with that power is entirely up to you. I mean, if you can convert and resist its pull, then you can push your speed up and push your apparent wind up. But to be honest, now that I've spent quite a lot of time on foil, the whole light wind speed thing seems to be, has a different perspective on it now. Twin tips and normal recreational boards, your main aim really is to try and get upwind. Yes, you can push the speed up, but what you're really trying to do is balance the power of the kite against your board. And big kites, because they're less efficient than small kites, and the wind is lighter, tend to naturally sit down the back of the window. And as your apparent wind increases, as your speed increases, they tend to go even further back in the window. And so it's kind of hard to build top speed with big kites. Getting going early, getting going upwind are the two biggest things to concentrate on, first of all, with big kites. If you want to go fast, you need a smaller kite. But, you know, we can't have perfect conditions all the time. So,
sure.
Yeah, it's managing that power really, rather than sort of concentrating on the speed side of things.
Yeah.
There's other much better ways to go about going fast than throwing cloth at it, really.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. And just to loop back a little bit again, so would you say, going back to the fact that we've got this, you know, this range of light wind kites from, I think the smallest I think is a 4 meter up to like 17 meter. Do the manufacturers generally, okay, so up to X size is for design for foil riders, and after X size, this is now designed for twin tips and people who want to, you know.
Yeah. Well,
is there a cut-off point, or is it just gradual?
It's. I mean, I think that now that we've been through race boards, box rule boards, free race boards like the sectors, the big directional boards, we're now into foiling. It's very clear that the future of big kites is either maneuver-oriented, so really lightweight, fast-turning, fun kites to throw, loop, turn, carve, all that kind of stuff, or it's high-power stability management racing side of things. And that, on the foil side, seems to be taken over by the foil kites. There is a tube kite that we make at the moment, has 5 struts, and it's fantastic for jumping, but it's heavy, and it doesn't work in light winds as much as the sort of the lighter kites. So yeah, you do see the split. You see the kites in the middle, the general freeride kites. They're not really making or selling really big ones anymore. They're either going for the lightweight or they're going for the racing. The stuff in the middle, the lithiums, all that kind of stuff. The focus is definitely pulling back from the biggest sizes, because, to be honest, the lightweight kites are running rings around them in maneuver-oriented riding. And for high-power racing, well, that's specialist stuff that only really team riders and racers are really interested in. And it's not really part of the public domain.
So do you see the day coming where, rather than, you know, having 3, let's say, lithiums, a 6, a 9, and a 12, you would have, you know, a lithium 6, a lithium 9, and then a light wind 12?
Well, they already kind of do that in some ways, but there was talk of the lightweight kites becoming the future of all kites, because unless you're really pushing for high power, for jumping with woo or racing, then that kind of upper end solidity that you need to really push your kites to and potentially beyond their design limits is pretty rare these days. And, you know, kites built specifically for that. But for general riding, the lightweight kites give such an unbelievable handling advantage that there is talk within the industry just of doing away with all the existing designs and replacing them with the super light designs.
Interesting. So you've almost got, so you'd have, you know, rather than like all the different camps that we've got at the moment, you'd have the light wind kites for the mass population, and then you would have the super high performance kites for the pros and the people who are really, really pushing it.
Exactly that. And, you know, a bit of freestyle maybe mixed in between, but it's looking from where I sit that the super lightweight kites, I personally think, will take over the mass market within the next 4 or 5 years.
Interesting. Okay, that's really interesting. Yeah, and that does kind of make sense with what I'm starting to see and hear as well from people who are riding these kites. They say, you know, these things are just now, the performance is unbelievable in comparison for the average rider.
Yeah, I agree. And for the experts who are concentrated in maneuver-oriented riding, the lightweight kites are just running rings around everything else. They're significantly better.
But for your free rider who just likes, you know, likes going out, doing a few jumps, seeing how high you can jump, not particularly competitive, you know, does a few back rolls, they're going to work for him as well.
Yeah, they will do. I mean, you must already have noticed that the mainstream kites used to be 5 strut. Now they've dropped to 3 strut, and that's become accepted. And 3 strut is obviously lighter than 5 strut and doesn't represent a decrease in the stability of the kites whatsoever. So, you know, the kites that I'm using with 1 strut, they may not be in their absolute element when they're pushed to the wall on full D-power with the canopies loose, but they're not getting out of shape and they're jumping really well. And unless you're chasing woo height or you're doing freestyle, I don't see any reason why you wouldn't buy an all-round kite with just 1 strut instead of 3. Yeah. I've already proven that from 5 to 3. And I genuinely think that the single strut kites now are just, you're not really losing anything on the top end, but you're gaining massively on the medium and lower end. Yeah. Makes an awful lot of sense.
And so why are there still, this is something that interests me for a while. Why are there still 5 strut kites out there? Because, you know, some manufacturers have still got 5 struts. You know, the mainstream has moved towards 3, but there is still obviously a need and a calling for 5 struts. Well, where do this, what, you know, for someone who's coming into this, what do the struts do? What do the struts give you in the kite?
They give extra stability to the canopy when it is pushed beyond its operating envelope. They guard against backwinding. They help set the profile a bit better so that the you know, with 5 struts going across the canopy, the camber of the kite is more precisely held in place to make it more efficient. But beyond that, they don't really do a massive amount.
Except add weight.
Yeah, they do. I mean, the kite that I use for jumping is the Vantage, and that is a 5 strut kite, and you really feel the weight of it when you come off the single strut kites, you really do. But when you're absolutely on the upper edge of D-power operating window, the stability of them is phenomenal, especially considering how high aspect they are. But the price to pay is weight. They just don't handle anywhere near as good as the maneuver-oriented kite. So you kind of have to pick your weapon.
Yeah, so as with all these things, it's always a compromise between one thing and another. So, yeah. Okay, and then the other objection the other objection that I hear an awful lot is, you know, light wind kites, that's just for fat boys. What would you say to someone saying that?
Yeah, there's a valid point to that argument. You know, there is, big guys need more power. Also, big guys have more resistance, and so when they resist the kite, it shoots further forward in the window and produces less power. So they're kind of double whammy for them. They need cloth. There's no way around it. They just need more cloth. lightweights and foiling opened my eyes on this. 9-meter kite, 6 knots of wind, 30 kilometers an hour. How's that? If you said that to me 4 years ago, I'd have just laughed and thought you were utterly crazy, but it's true. And all that revolves around apparent wind. So lightweights on big kites, you can get much better performance in light winds on medium-sized kites if you change your board. But if your board is still fairly high in power requirement, say twin tip, a pretty high rocker, you're still going to need to throw some cloth at it to really get going in light winds. 14 meter for a lightweight is not really a massive kite. It's enough. Probably don't need to go to 17, but yeah, there is a place for bigger kites for medium and lightweight riders if they're not going to make the transition to ultra efficient boards. Mm-hmm. If you're looking at light winds, extreme performance in light winds, kite helps, no doubt. But the other side of it is efficiency. Foiling taught me this. 6 knots of wind I get going. My fastest ever foil speed is around about 50 kilometers an hour, and that's between 8 and 10 knots of wind with a 10-meter tube kite. Those numbers don't quite marry up. And the reason that they do is because of efficiency. Foils are incredibly efficient, but normal boards can also be very efficient. Box reel race boards, they're a nightmare to ride, but they give a good example of efficiency, and they're right up there with that kind of stuff. But also twin tips, low rocker twin tips are brilliant in light winds. There may be a bit of a handful when it's choppy, but stuff like door boards, those big long 150 by 50, very flat, very parallel twin tips, they're an absolutely huge boost to light wind potential. Also, just general bigger twin tips. If you have an old bigger twin tip, try it in light winds. You'd be amazed the difference. So, there's as much to be gained on the kite side as there is on the board side. And if you get an efficient light wind oriented kite and pair it with an efficient light wind oriented board, the ultimate example of which is a foil board, but there are other examples, the gains that you will find will be enormous.
And just to define that, just to help define that a little bit, where would you class kind of, I know this is an arbitrary figure picked out of the air, but heavy riders, where would you kind of put that? Or does the industry have the weights in mind when it divides light riders to heavy riders, things like this?
I mean, light riders sub 75 kilos, I would say. From 75 to 90 kilos, you can get, we call them light-footed or heavy-footed riders. In that sort of weight bracket, 75 to 90, you get some people who just dance and they don't seem to have any weight. They're very good at keeping their boards going, keeping their kites going, and can get away with murder. Some people at that weight kite like they weigh 100 kilos and seem to ebb away board speed just as soon as the slightest thing sort of knocks them. And so they tend to be very heavy-footed. But above 90 kilos, you need cloth. There's no way around it. You kind of can't disguise that kind of need for power. You need more wind or more drive. No matter how light you are on your feet, you've got extra drag. So you need it pulled, really. Yeah, cool. Well, I've always considered myself light on my feet. I think my mum would disagree. So I think I'd probably fall into the heavy-footed category there, unfortunately. But yeah, that's super good, because this is another question I get asked an awful lot. Where does that classification break down? Where does heavy rider start? And I think it's quite confusing for a lot of people, especially because a lot of the wind speed charts are kind of based on a 75 kg rider. So a 90 kg guy comes up and goes, well, how does that apply to me? So it's really good to have that kind of defined and to understand. Don't even get me started on trying to put wind speeds and weights and kites in pigeonholes. A lot of people don't understand that wind speeds, by and large, are so unbelievably inaccurate that I've completely given up trying to quote them at all. I'll give you one example. Back in the day, I went to Egypt where it was 40 degrees and really dry, and I had a 12-meter kite, and I could ride that right up until 40 knots. 40 knots in Egypt, this 12-meter kite. I came home to the UK, 8 degrees, 28 knots, put the same kite in the air, and almost had an accident. It was that overpowered, and I couldn't understand why. And I went away and did some reading, and the density and temperature of the wind has such a massive effect on the energy released in the kite that with any wind speed given, you have to give the humidity and the temperature at the same time. Otherwise, it's at worst, it's dangerous, you know.
Yeah, fully understand that, because that's that when we were in Tarifa, the difference between Levante, which is a dry, hot wind, and a Poniente, was, you know, it was such a difference. It was just unbelievable. Yeah. And I think you're right. I think this is where a word I can never pronounce, anemometers and things like this, they're great as a guide, but you've got to take in so many of the considerations as well at the same time.
The anemometer gives you the speed, gives you a very accurate indication of the speed of the wind. It doesn't tell you the density, and that is enormous.
Yeah,
massive difference.
It's actually more important, I think, in a lot of cases than the speed. Yeah. Okay. So, Airush have got a new kite out, obviously the Ultra V2, and it is getting rave reviews. A lot of people have been very, very interested to find out a lot more about this. So can you talk a little bit about the V2 and kind of where it sits in this, you know, in the picture that we've been talking about?
I mean, Airush have always made a lightweight kite. They were the first people to make a 3-strut kite in something called a trio years and years ago, and they've always had an interest in lightweight kites. And with the advent of foiling, and more specifically the advent of freeride foiling, they started to push forward that design envelope again. And last year they brought a kite out called the Ultra, which got an absolute cult following. There's a thread on Kite Forum that is pages, and I think it's 20 pages or something like that. And it is full of praise. And never in your wildest dream would you think that a thread on Kiteboarder would have anything else but fighting and slagging off and backbiting. But this thread is just like something from heaven. People love the kite, and it's justifiable as well. I rode the 9-meter for foiling all last year. The 12 was never in my van because it would go out and demo and it wouldn't come back. People would refuse to give it me back, so I'd break a new one out. And I'd sell out, and I didn't have one. But then I learned that the 9 actually goes as early as the 12, so I just gave up on the 12, and that's all I've used. It is so tactile. It feels like an extension of your arm. You can fly it with one hand. You get back on a traditional kite, and it just feels like you're trying to play a piano in oven gloves. It's immediate. It's unbelievably stable. I've put super thin race lines on my 10-meter now, and the wind speeds that I can go out in are ridiculously light. It's so stable and so quick to accelerate around the window. You can get a power spike to get your initial board speed up to get apparent wind in winds that I could never have dreamt of riding in before. And yet when it gets windy, the handling of it under power, because of the lightweight, it really shows up your technique, because everything that you do wrong is down to your bad timing, not a delay or a fudge in the kite or it being in the wrong place. Everything is down to you. So it's teaching me a lot more as well, and we're having huge success with it. It's, as I say, it's so much of a difference that I think it's going to shape the future of the general kites that we use within the next 4 or 5 years.
Cool. Well, actually, that sounds terrible, because now riding one of these, I've no longer got the excuse of it's the kite, it's not me. So I'm not sure about that, actually.
It's always you.
Shh. Never. But because I know there's been an incredible amount of kind of research and attention to detail gone into this model. Can you talk a little bit about, why it is so good and why it is getting these rave reviews? What are the specific changes that have been made that make this kite this kind of wonder kite that it's become?
Yeah, I mean, that's probably a question more accurately answered by the designer. That said, getting the weight down that much needs to be done carefully. You know, your reinforcement needs to be stripped back to a point at which the reinforcement can be done away with, but to leave the entire skeleton of the kite very much able to take knocks and bangs. We use a load frame in it, which is a spider's web. If you look at the kite or pictures of it, you'll see a spider's web covering the canopy, and that spider's web consists of interlocking kite line, basically Dyneema across the whole thing. So the entire, this is the same for all the other Airush kites as well, actually. The load frame takes the load of the kite. The canopy cloth is not responsible for carrying the load of the kite anymore. It's there to stop the air from getting through. We still use D3O on it, which is the most expensive kite fabric you can buy. And the Dacron is the same as everything else, but with only one strut and minimizing the diameter of it, minimizing the diameter of the front leading edge, and still giving it a little bit of profile to make sure that it's stable and it's got good power range. We've just been able to knock the weight down bit by bit by bit until we get to something that's well tested as being still very, very durable. To put the durability in context, most of the schools that we're dealing with now are looking at putting ultras in. Several of the schools that we've dealt with for many, many years are now exclusively teaching on the ultra, and it's capable of taking a lot of punishment. So yeah, it has to be carefully done, the weight side of things, but there's more to it than just the weight. The turning speed of the ultra is very, very high. It's got quite big wingtips, and the wingtips aid with the speed of turn a lot. So they also aid a lot with the relaunch, and it's accelerating and turning, and also forward turning. So when a kite turns, bow kite, when you turn it, they tend to spin on the spot like that. And while they spin like that, they don't produce any power. A forward turning kite, they tend to turn not by breaking a wingtip and causing it to spin, they actually turn by scissoring. So the kite twists like this, and it means that as they've twisted, one wingtip is ahead of the other, and that wingtip will power it round a curve. So a forward turning kite, when it's turning, still produces as much power as it would do in a straight line. And that's what makes the Ultra one of the best light wind kites around, because you can throw the thing like crazy all over the back of the window and never have it go in a straight line, yet the whole time the kite is producing huge amounts of power. And that's something that's quite difficult to build into a kite. They do it with freestyle kites, which is why those guys with the big square wingtips on sea kites can have the kite do kite loops and not reduce its power through the loop. So they're still climbing, and they're still climbing to the top of the window so they can parachute down and land. But that's a fundamental thing of the Ultra that makes it very, very good for light winds. No power is wasted. So, yeah.
And this actually ties in perfectly to another question I had, because another kind of common complaint, if you like, that people have about light wind kites is, or because they've only got one strut or zero struts in some cases, they get really spongy when they turn. But I know that, because of this, the load frame that is built into this kite, that's not as big an issue with the Ultra as it is with a lot of these kites.
The load frame is fantastic. It's one of the most revolutionary things, I think, to happen in the last few years. But you put a load frame in a kite and it actually stiffens it up. So this scissoring action is actually hindered by the load frame. And you have to really carefully engineer it in to, at worst, leave the scissoring action alone, if not aid it to advance it. But that scissoring action in the kite is fundamental to the way that the Ultra works. And the Razor, again, which works in a similar way. Mm-hmm. So you have to be really careful with that, because you really can ruin a kite. by taking away that forward turning ability. It's one of the fundamental aspects of the kite, in my view, that sets a good kite from a bad kite.
Cool, cool. So changes. I know we talked about the V1 having sort of the original Ultra, having this huge cult following. You know, for those guys who are listening and who've got the Ultra One and are thinking about upgrading,
Yeah.
What are the major differences between the V1 and the V2?
Yeah, the V2, they did a lot of prototyping. We've got, I've had a go on a couple of them, but throughout the development side of things, they were putting quite a bit of R&D kite out there with riders to find out what they thought. And the consensus was that from 9 meter and down over, everything that they changed had byproducts that weren't always positive. They were better in some ways, but from 9 down over, everything stayed the same. The kite is essentially the same. Different colors, different graphics, but the actual cut and pattern of the kite is the same. It's a phenomenal kite. If it's not broken, don't try and fix it. So many times, change for change's sake has resulted in unhappy people. We don't want that, so we completely left it as it was. Now there's a new size in the 10, and in that size, 10, 12, new size in 14, and a new size in 17, the design has changed. It's become lighter weight per size. It's become slightly tighter in the canopy, and it's become slightly more focused towards speed and response. And in those sizes, 10 meter, certainly the 12, the difference is most definitely better. Mm-hmm. And it's really, in that side of things, that's where the development's going to be, in the ultra light wind handling response. Because when it's reasonably breezy from 9 meter and down over, you're focusing on control and handling. But from 10 meters and up over, you're really focusing on getting the most you can out of the minimum amount of wind. And that's where the development curve has seen a sort of a boost this year.
So who is the Ultra built for?
When it came out, we thought, yeah, this is going to be really focused towards foiling light winds only. But as time has progressed, we've seen so many people from all aspects of general kiting come to it and love it. And it's the answer to that question, I have no idea where it'll stop. It just keeps going and going. I would say that anybody who has an interest in how their kite handles should take a long, hard look at the Ultra. It is from wave riding to old school free ride to foiling to just general riding. You can't really say anything negative about having a kite that is superior in handling. What it will not be as good as, potentially, is big, high wind, aggressive, hardcore, storm chasing, boot-bound, freestyle riding. That side of things, yeah. Struts, different canopies, a bit more weight in order to keep things under control when it's under sustained extreme overpower is not, a good thing to have. And everywhere else, I can see these ultra light kites just eating into the traditional kite market every step of the way. If you take the no strut kites, the BRM kites, I know for a fact they don't jump. The Ultra boosts. It really jumps. It really, really does jump. It's not shy at all. Again, forward turns, landings on it, absolutely perfect. You go back up before you come back down when you redirect the thing. So just for general riding, unless it's an ego thing where, oh yeah, you're obviously not going to be able to jump as well as I can because you've got one of those Ultras. Until the public gets their head around the fact that actually that attitude is pretty much wrong, I don't see the Ultra being a hindrance for any mainstream rider. It's only going to be more fun to use when you turn a corner, whether that be jibing, wave riding, looping, sort of transitional loops. I'm not talking about kite loops, but, sort of fun riding. then it's an awesome kite.
Perfect. Right, well, thank you very much for that, sir.
No worries.
So if that's got you excited, guys, and you're interested in buying a V2, I've set up a special page where you can not only buy the V2, but get a huge amount of extra goodies as a bonus to say thank you from me as well for listening to this podcast. So the link is in the show notes somewhere around this video. Click that link, go through to the page. You'll need to send me an email to let me know where you are in the world so we can calculate postage. And then we'll get the kites out to you. That simple. Delivery time's normally 1 day to the UK, 3 to 5 days for the rest of the world. But we'll let you know all that once you've sent the email in. So head over to the page, as I say, the kite itself, but you also get a huge amount of bundled free goodies from us to say thank you for listening to the podcast. So head over there, fill the form in, and we'll get you one of these awesome kites in the post. Thank you for listening, guys. As always, if you enjoyed that, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. And I'll see you in the next episode.